The stage was set. The lights softened to a moody glow. Viewers across the country tuned in, anticipating the clash of generations that had been teased for days on social media. The iconic set of Real Talk with Ava Monroe was unusually quiet because tonight's guest wasn't just another celebrity. He was history walking. Walter Gaines, 90 years old, a legendary actor, Oscar-winning director, and a man whose quiet strength had shaped decades of American cinema. He had portrayed warriors, mentors, fathers, and revolutionaries, not just on screen, but in real life. He had marched during the Civil Rights Movement, stood firm through scandal and praise, and never once sought to go viral. And yet here he was, on the verge of going viral again. His opponent? Ava Monroe, 32, one of the most watched media personalities in the country. Sharp, articulate, fearless. She made a name for herself by dismantling the old guard, one viral clip at a time. With millions of followers and a talent for cutting questions, she was the voice of a new generation, progressive, impatient, and ready to rewrite the rules. The promo for tonight's episode had promised fireworks. One chair, two generations. Who still deserves the mic? When Walter entered, the audience stood, unsure if out of respect or curiosity. He walked slowly but firmly, wearing a tailored black suit, cane in hand, not for weakness, but for style. His silver-gray beard framed a face that had seen the rise and fall of eras. He sat across from Ava with calm eyes and a closed-lipped smile. He looked unbothered, grounded, as if the moment wasn't about proving himself, but about proving something far bigger. Ava leaned in, smiling for the cameras. "Mr. Gaines, you've been called a living legend, but also, let's be honest, a symbol of a time that many people believe we need to move past. How do you respond to that?" Walter paused. The audience leaned forward. Then he said in a voice as smooth as aged oak, "I'd rather be a symbol of a time when people listened before they spoke, when we earned respect before demanding it." The room fell into silence. That wasn't just a soundbite. That was a warning. This wasn't going to be a takedown. It was going to be a test, for both of them. This was the return of a man who never needed to chase attention, because when he spoke, people had no choice but to listen. What happens next might surprise you. If you're ready for a masterclass in grace, grit, and generational truth, hit the number 7 in the comments to keep watching, because sometimes it's not the loudest voice that wins. It's the one that's lasted the longest. While the audience waited for the interview to unfold, what they didn't see was the blueprint behind the broadcast. A carefully crafted setup designed not to explore Walter Gaines' legacy, but to dismantle it. In the sleek control room overlooking the studio floor, Ava Monroe huddled with her producers just hours before airtime. Coffee cups rattled next to laptops filled with research, social media polls, and a list titled Trigger Questions. Ava stood at the center, her heels clicking on the polished concrete as she reviewed the final rundown. "This isn't just another episode," she reminded them. "This is a generational statement. Walter Gaines represents everything the new era is pushing past. He's strong, old school, and unapologetically traditional. We need to expose that." Her producers nodded, feeding her carefully phrased talking points. Some were masked as philosophical inquiries, others thinly veiled traps. Ava didn't want a conversation. She wanted a clash, a viral moment, the kind of exchange that would trend on Twitter within minutes and be clipped into TikToks by the hour. Ask him about gender roles, about toxic masculinity, about his silence during the Me Too wave. One assistant whispered, "Keep it respectful, but loaded." In another corner of the room, Devin Carter, one of the younger production interns, quietly observed. He wasn't like the others. Raised on Walter Gaines films by his grandfather, Devin considered Walter a personal hero. His stomach turned watching the checklist of confrontational topics, seeing his idol treated like a stepping stone to higher ratings. He hesitated, then walked over to Ava. "Are we really doing this? He's not a politician. He's Walter Gaines." Ava glanced at him, eyebrows raised. "He's a symbol," she replied coldly, "and symbols need to be questioned. Besides, if he's as wise as everyone claims, he'll handle it." Devin stepped back, silenced. The machine was already in motion. Back on the studio floor, Final camera checks were underway. The hot mic was tested, makeup adjusted. Ava's stage presence kicked in, her expression a mix of charm and challenge. Walter sat quietly backstage, sipping tea, reviewing nothing. He hadn't asked for the questions in advance. He didn't need to. He knew what was coming. Not the specifics, but the tone. He could sense it in the way Ava's team avoided eye contact when he entered, in the way the energy shifted the moment he took his seat. They weren't welcoming a guest. They were setting a stage for a takedown. But what they didn't know, what none of them could predict, was that Walter Gaines had been through real battles. And this was just another performance. The red recording light glowed. Millions of viewers leaned closer to their screens. Inside the studio, the room felt colder, tighter, as if oxygen had been reduced, replaced by sheer anticipation. Ava Monroe straightened in her seat, crossing one leg over the other. Her posture was graceful but guarded, like a fencer waiting for the first strike. Across from her, Walter Gaines remained as he was, unmoved, hands resting calmly on his knee, his eyes locked onto hers with the patience of a man who had weathered far greater storms than this. Ava lifted the next card from her lap. Mr. Gaines, your career spans over 6 decades, but with all due respect, some say it reflects a time that glorified dominance, especially masculine dominance. The lone hero, the silent father, the unemotional man. Don't you think that kind of image contributed to generations of emotional repression? Walter didn't respond right away. He shifted slightly, not out of discomfort, but precision, the way a sculptor steps back to examine his work before chiseling the next line. I played men who carried burdens, he said, not because they were told not to cry, but because someone had to carry the weight when others couldn't. There was no defensiveness in his voice, just clarity, a stillness that came from knowing the difference between silence and suppression. Ava pressed in. But don't you think those same values, emotional distance, control, pride, are exactly what younger generations are trying to unlearn? Walter's eyes didn't waver. Maybe they are, but tearing down an old house doesn't guarantee you'll build a better one, especially if you haven't lived long enough to know why the walls were there in the first place. The crowd murmured faintly, but the producers muted the studio audience. This was a battle of ideas, not applause. Ava paused. Her next question was sharper, personal. You've never apologized for any of your past portrayals, characters that critics now say upheld systemic masculinity. Would you do it differently if you had the chance? Walter's answer was deliberate. I didn't create culture. I held a mirror to it. If people didn't like what they saw, maybe the problem wasn't the reflection, but the reality. That hit harder than she expected. A flicker passed across Ava's expression. Was it irritation, uncertainty, or respect? She moved quickly to regain momentum. Let's talk legacy. You've mentored dozens of actors, but many of them say you were hard, distant, even harsh. Was that just tough love, or did you struggle with closeness? Walter leaned forward ever so slightly. His tone dropped, softer but sharper. Closeness isn't always loud. You can teach someone to stand without holding their hand every step of the way. If I was hard, it was because I wanted them to be harder than what the world would throw at them. A long silence followed. Ava Monroe blinked. She had prepared for confrontation. What she hadn't prepared for was conviction. And as the cameras kept rolling, the tension didn't explode. It tightened, like a string pulled taut, holding two worlds apart by the thinnest thread. What began as a strategic ambush slowly started to feel like something else entirely. Ava Monroe had prepared for fire, defensiveness, denial, maybe even anger. That's what usually happened when powerful people were put under pressure. It was her signature move, make them squirm, crack, stumble. She didn't need them to explode, just to react. But Walter Gaines wasn't reacting. He was reflecting, like water, and that unnerved her more than any outburst ever could. She studied him between questions, trying to find signs of wear, a tightened jaw, a nervous twitch, a sigh of fatigue. But Walter showed none of it. He answered every question not like a man defending his record, but like a grandfather telling a story. measured, precise, and laced with the kind of lived-in truth that couldn't be Googled or rehearsed. Producers in the control room watched in growing confusion. The emotional tempo they had counted on wasn't happening. Ava wasn't flustering him. If anything, he was centering her. Each pointed question landed like a match tossed at a stone wall. No sparks, no fire, just calm, and the audience noticed. Though the cameras didn't show it, the live crowd's posture began to shift. People who had entered with skepticism, perhaps even ready to see a legend crumble, were now leaning in. Their expressions softened. A few even nodded as Walter spoke, not because they agreed with everything, but because they sensed something rare. A man who didn't speak to win, but to understand. Ava reached for a riskier line of attack. "Mr. Gaines," she said, voice just a shade edgier. "You've worked in an industry known for vanity and ego, yet you've always kept a low profile, rarely granting interviews. Why now? Why me?" Walter looked at her fully then, not as an opponent, but as a person. "Because people aren't listening to each other anymore," and he said, "and maybe if I sit still long enough, someone out there will remember how to." No mic drop, no zinger, just truth, spoken gently enough to echo. And in that moment, something shifted, not in the questions, but in the room itself. Ava wasn't steering the narrative anymore. She was being pulled into his rhythm, and that composure, the kind that came not from training, but from having nothing left to prove, was quietly, unmistakably taking control. The tension in the studio had turned from subtle to electric. Ava Monroe, once confidently leading the charge, now felt the terrain beneath her shifting. Every sharp question she threw was absorbed, softened, and returned by Walter Gaines with a kind of grace that didn't deflect. It disarmed. And as the interview entered its midpoint, Ava knew she needed to regain control. So she pivoted. "Mr. Gaines," she began, "you speak of responsibility and tradition like they're universal truths. But the world is different now. We've evolved. Don't you think clinging to those ideals is like locking your doors after the neighborhood has already changed?" Walter tilted his head slightly, absorbing her metaphor. Then, for the first time during the entire interview, he leaned forward. Not aggressively, but with intention. His fingers laced together. His voice dropped to a calm but commanding register. "Let me ask you something, Ava," he said. A pause. Even the floor manager froze mid-step. "Tonight," Walter continued, "if your house were broken into, would you rather be standing next to a man who knows how to write poetry or a man who knows how to protect you?" The question wasn't delivered with sarcasm or condescension. It was deliberate, grounded, and devastating in its simplicity. Ava's mouth opened slightly, perhaps to respond, perhaps just to breathe. But no words came. The audience felt it instantly, not because Walter had won the exchange, but because he had reframed the entire conversation in a single sentence. He hadn't dismissed the value of poetry. He had simply reminded everyone that strength and safety are not outdated. They're fundamental. For a moment, the studio was silent. Not dead air, living silence. The kind that makes people sit back and reevaluate everything they thought they knew. Ava blinked, regrouping. "That's quite the example," she replied, trying to reclaim her footing. Walter offered a faint smile. "Examples help us see clearly when arguments just make noise." Even the control room couldn't deny it. This wasn't going the way they'd planned. Comment sections across platforms were already lighting up with fire emojis and exclamation points. This moment was going viral, because the question wasn't just for Ava, it was for everyone. If you believe Walter made a powerful point, comment 7 below. If you think Ava still has the upper hand, press 0. Either way, stay tuned. Because this conversation, it's only just beginning. The studio was still reeling from Walter Gaines's question, the kind that sliced through the noise and left the air heavy with reflection. Ava Monroe tried to move forward, adjusting her note cards and shifting in her seat, but something had shifted. The audience wasn't leaning toward her anymore. They were watching Walter, not just with curiosity, but with reverence. Then, without warning, a voice rose from the darkened audience seating area. "May I speak?" Ava turned sharply. So did the cameras. Security paused in place, unsure whether to intervene. The voice was soft, feminine, and familiar. Though few recognized it at first, a spotlight found her. She stood slowly, dressed in a simple blue blazer and jeans. No makeup crew, no microphone, just presence. The audience gasped as they realized who it was. Dr. Linda Gaines, Walter's estranged daughter, a Harvard-educated psychologist, published author, and respected thought leader in progressive circles. Linda had made headlines years ago when she publicly disagreed with her father's views on gender roles and parenting. Their fallout was quiet but not unnoticed. Most assumed they hadn't spoken in years. Ava's eyes widened. This wasn't planned. Walter looked at his daughter, not surprised but not entirely settled either. "I wasn't supposed to be here," Linda began, her voice trembling but steady. "But when I heard this interview was happening, I had to come." The audience sat in stunned silence. "For years I resented this man," she continued. "I thought his values were outdated, that his way of teaching, stoic, firm, sometimes painfully silent, was a wall I could never climb. But now at 46, raising 2 kids of my own, I understand." She paused, looking directly at Walter. "I understand that while he didn't always speak in hugs and softness, he taught me strength. He didn't protect me from the world. He prepared me for it." Walter said nothing. His eyes, always composed, glistened faintly beneath the lights. "I came here tonight to say something I should have said a long time ago," Linda said, turning toward the crowd. "My father is not a relic. He is a compass, and we need to stop throwing away the very foundations that helped build us." The room erupted, not with cheers, but with the kind of silent awe that fills sacred spaces. Even Ava couldn't hide her reaction, caught between journalistic detachment and human emotion. The segment was never meant to include guests, but sometimes the truth doesn't wait for an invitation, and sometimes it wears the voice of someone you thought was long gone. The studio was hushed, almost reverent, after Dr. Linda Gaines returned to her seat. Her words had shifted the air entirely, turning what was meant to be a televised sparring match into something deeper, something more human. Even Ava Monroe, who had built her reputation on composure and quick comebacks, sat unusually quiet. Her note cards were forgotten on her lap. The battle, if there had ever been one, was over. But Walter Gaines wasn't done. He sat forward slowly, as if rising not from his chair, but from the weight of a lifetime. His eyes scanned the room, not to command attention, but to acknowledge it. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and low, yet every syllable carried. "I didn't come here tonight to defend my past," he began. "I came because, somewhere along the way, we confused disagreement with disrespect and lost the ability to do either with dignity." Ava looked up. Walter didn't meet her eyes. Not out of avoidance, but purpose. He wasn't speaking to her now. He was speaking to everyone. "I've been called outdated, old school, even dangerous," he continued. "And maybe I am. But I've lived long enough to know that when we discard every brick that built the house, we're left with walls that can't stand." He paused, letting the silence breathe. "There's value in change, but there's also value in roots. I've seen generations rise and fall, movements bloom and burn, and through it all, one thing has never gone out of style." He leaned back, his voice softer now. "Respect." The word landed like a final note in a symphony. Simple, clean, unshakable. Not the kind that demands applause or attention, the kind that looks someone in the eye even when you disagree and says, "I see you." The kind that lets you listen before you speak, that lets you stand your ground without shoving someone else off theirs. The room was utterly still. No buzzing phones, no whispered side comments, just the quiet awe of people watching a man who had nothing to prove, yet everything to say. Walter folded his hands again. "Respect," he repeated, almost to himself this time, "isn't something we outgrow. It's something we pass on." He glanced at Ava Monroe for the first time since he began. She didn't speak. She simply nodded. The edge in her posture softened, maybe even humbled. There was no dramatic mic drop, no sweeping camera spin, just a legend seated in stillness, offering a truth the world had nearly forgotten. And in that moment, one thing was undeniable. Respect is timeless. The interview ended, but its impact had only just begun. Before the final credits of Real Talk with Ava Monroe had even finished rolling, the internet detonated. The clip of Walter's calm question, "When your house is broken into," was reposted more than 1 million times in under an hour. Users across Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube stitched reactions of shock, admiration, and for some, tears. People weren't just watching, they were re-watching, over and over again. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them, the control, the clarity, the conviction. In a world oversaturated with shouting, Walter Gaines had captured the globe's attention by speaking softly and carrying a lifetime of earned wisdom. Within hours, long-form think pieces flooded media outlets. The Atlantic titled its column, "A Masterclass in Grace Under Fire." Time ran with, "Walter Gaines didn't just win, he changed the rules." Even Variety, more used to red carpets than real-time reckonings, released a feature headlined, "When a Legend Teaches a Nation How to Listen Again." Clips of Dr. Linda Gaines's surprise appearance began to spread like wildfire, especially among younger viewers. Her emotional reconciliation with her father struck a universal chord. A new generation, raised to question authority, suddenly found itself respecting it in a way they hadn't expected. Comment sections read like confessions. "I started watching to see Walter get shut down. I ended up crying. That man reminded me of my grandfather. I miss hearing truth like that." Walter Gaines didn't destroy Ava. He elevated the entire conversation. This is what leadership used to look like. For Ava Monroe, the reaction was a double-edged sword. While some of her loyal followers praised her for hosting the interview, others accused her of attempting a takedown that backfired. A handful called it the first time she looked out of her depth. Yet even critics commended her for staying in the chair when the moment got bigger than she expected. By morning, network executives were scrambling to respond to the surge. Ratings had tripled. Syndication offers poured in. Requests to re-air the interview came from educational institutions, veteran organizations, and leadership summits nationwide. And through it all, Walter Gaines said nothing. He didn't tweet. He didn't grant follow-up interviews. He simply returned to his quiet life, letting the echoes of his message travel without him. Because that was the point all along. True respect doesn't need a spotlight. It just needs to be remembered. The storm had passed, but its resonance lingered. In the days following the broadcast, the world continued to speak Walter Gaines's name, but he himself had fallen silent again. By choice. No press tour, no victory lap. Just the sound of an old man rising with the sun, pouring coffee into a chipped ceramic mug, and tending to the garden he planted with his late wife decades ago. While pundits dissected every word of his interview, Walter was pulling weeds, pruning roses, and watching robins peck at breadcrumbs on his porch railing. Because to him, the true reward had never been applause. It had always been endurance. In one quiet evening, Walter had become something larger than a legend. He had become a symbol of something our culture had nearly lost, a living heritage. Not a relic of a forgotten time, but a breathing embodiment of values too deep to fade. Dignity, strength, patience, and the courage to speak without shouting. His words were now being taught in classrooms. Clips of his interview were shared by pastors, professors, parents. Some called it the moment the generations reconnected. Not because everyone agreed with him, but because everyone finally listened. In a world fractured by noise, Walter Gaines had reminded us how powerful it is to sit still and speak from the soul. Back at the network, Ava Monroe reviewed the footage again, not as a host, but as a student. She had stepped into the arena expecting to challenge a symbol. Instead, she met a man, one who didn't argue to win, but to understand. And in doing so, he'd redefined what strength looked like for millions of viewers, including her. Walter's daughter, Dr. Linda Gaines, started a new foundation in her father's honor, the Gaines Legacy Institute, dedicated to bridging generational gaps through storytelling, mentorship, and character education. She named the initiative's motto after her father's final words, "Respect is timeless." And Walter, he didn't post about it. He didn't need to. He simply kept living. His legacy didn't hang in museums or sit on bookshelves. It walked in the footsteps of those he had touched, in students who now respected their teachers, in young men who learned that stillness is a form of strength, and in daughters who rediscovered the men they thought they had lost. He was proof that some stories don't fade when the credits roll. They live on, in word, in memory, in silence. Because real heritage doesn't just belong in the past, it walks beside us, every single day. Walter Gaines didn't just sit in a chair for an interview. He sat in a moment that would become a mirror, reflecting back to us what we've nearly forgotten in today's fast-paced, noisy world. The quiet power of dignity and the unshakable value of experience. For older adults watching, the interview was more than a clash of generations. It was a validation. So many of us know what it feels like to be told that our time has passed, that our wisdom is no longer relevant, that the world has moved on without us. But Walter reminded us that age doesn't erase relevance. It proves it. With each pause, each thoughtful reply, he demonstrated that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it sits still, speaks softly, and leaves the room speechless. In a time when shouting the loudest often wins the spotlight, Walter chose a different way. He didn't interrupt. He didn't attack. He didn't defend out of pride. He responded with the steadiness of a man who had walked through real storms and survived. That kind of calm doesn't come from reading books or watching newsreels. It comes from living. And that is something no trend, no platform, no viral moment can ever replace. There's a deep lesson here for all of us, especially those in the later chapters of life. We may no longer run the boardrooms or raise young children, but we hold something far greater: perspective. We've seen the world change more than once. We've watched styles, values, and leaders come and go. And through it all, we've learned what truly matters: respect, responsibility, and character. Walter's story is a gentle call to action. Don't shrink back. The world still needs our voices. Our families need our guidance. Our communities need our steadiness. We are not old-fashioned. We are the foundation. And when we stand up, with patience and purpose, we give the next generation something solid to hold on to. So whether you're a grandparent, a veteran, a retired teacher, or simply someone who has lived enough to know the truth, let Walter's legacy be your reminder. Your value isn't behind you, it's in you. If this story reminded you of your strength, press number 7 in the comments below. Share this video with a friend or loved one who may need to be reminded that their wisdom still matters. And stay with us, because our next story may be the very one your heart is waiting for. Because legacy isn't what we leave behind. It's how we live right now.